people can believe anything good about themselves. Most people who held slaves thought they were doing the world a good thing, including the slaves, by educating and Christianizing them. Slavery is a welfare system. It provided for young people and old people, unlike, capitalist industrialism, which chewed people up and spat them out. Anybody can convince that anything, I think, that's in their interest is actually in the interest of the general good.
I think one of the tensions that is implicit in your book is this idea that the government should be run by disinterested people who have achieved enough wealth previously in their life that they can afford to be in the government and not express their own narrow interests. And that obviously is an elitist system. And there's always been this contra argument that this promotion of private interests is what politics should be about instead. Obviously, in current times, especially with the rise of lobbying with our current president, we're in an era where it is all about the promotion of private interests. How do you think about that tension?
It's a great question. Let me break it into two different parts. I mean, one is the idea, should government promote the public interest, or is interest group pluralism a normatively attractive thing? And the other is a view whether there really are a class of disinterested people and whether there's any correlation between that and wealth. So I think all the framers believed that government should promote the public interest. That's a big part of American history. It's really not. I think, I guess you get some statements, in the early 20th century that what's good for General Motors is good for the country. And then you get political scientists, writing in the 1950s saying, well, interest group pluralism is all we have. And because there's so many interest groups, they'll break against each other and you'll emerge with something that's more in the public interest. And then some of them even invoke Madison's Federalist 10 for that proposition. But that's a misreading of Federalist 10. What Madison thought was in a large geographic area, there'd be a greater diversity of interests, so they would clash. And then maybe when they clashed and fell apart, you could have somebody genuinely pursuing the public interest. But I don't think at the founding or for many, many decades afterwards, there were many Americans who would have openly identified as a good thing the idea that government just pursued the interests of some private entity. So all of Jacksonian democracy, which swept the country, beginning in the early 19th century and remained pretty much hegemonic until the 1850s, the whole idea of Jacksonian democracy was that a wealthy group had taken control of the national government, people like stockholders in the national bank, and that we needed to get government back to the idea of promoting the public interest. Okay, so Madison clearly believes in the public interest, but he also believes that the people who will pursue that public interest, as you said, are the wealthy elite who've got it made and don't need to worry about, kind of commercial interests. They can think about what's good for the country. That's just an association between people and a kind of attractive, whitewashed view of themselves, which probably throughout history people have always held, right? People can believe anything good about themselves. Most people who held slaves thought they were doing the world a good thing, including the slaves, by educating and Christianizing them. Slavery is a welfare system. It provided for young people and old people, unlike, capitalist industrialism, which chewed people up and spat them out. Anybody can convince that anything, I think, that's in their interest is actually in the interest of the general good. So, people like Madison and Jefferson and Hamilton certainly thought that they were pursuing the public interest, but it just happened to be that their view of the public interest was paper money is the worst thing you could imagine, and that ordinary people don't have the talent to run government. And their opponents, the Anti-Federalists, which is a name given to the people who opposed ratification, they didn't believe that, right? They were much more democratic, and they think the average barkeeper or blacksmith or carpenter had the basic sense and experience to run government. They could participate in government. Government should consist of ordinary people as much as wealthy people. So that was a more modern view. And that view, I think, quickly spread to the point that, you really couldn't get, except in South Carolina, which was very aristocratic all the way to the Civil War, you really couldn't get a lot of people running for office saying, I'm wealthy and I know better than you. It might still be that the wealthy people would be elected, but they had to put on this pretense of populism, very much like a lot of the Republican Party today, right? I mean, the Republican Party as a populist party is absurd when you look at what it stands for, because the only thing they really care about is tax cuts for the wealthy, eviscerating the social safety net, and deregulation of as large a swath of the economy as possible. Right, the only law they passed in the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration is a massive tax cut.
But it is a fact that even if the elections are free and fair, most likely the richer are more likely to be elected. The median net worth of a US senator today is more than 70 times the census reported median US household net worth. It seems to me that the framers really use this layered election, think about the electoral votes for president, as a way to filter the ordinary man from any high position and just allow only the wealthy to emerge. And to some extent, it was a walking back of the promise of the revolution where everybody was created equal and had equal opportunity to rise to the top.
You're exactly right. The framers wanted to filter ordinary men out of office. Madison talked about enlarging and refining the popular will. And there are a bunch of ways to do that. You mentioned the Electoral College, indirect elections. So state legislatures pick senators, electors chose the president. Wasn't even clear that electors would be directly elected by the people. They could be just chosen by state legislatures. Another important mechanism was large constituencies. They created a tiny House of Representatives. It was 65 members for the entire country. Compare that to the Massachusetts lower house of the legislature, which had over 300 representatives from Massachusetts, right? A representative from the Massachusetts legislature represented 1,500 people, and a representative in Congress represented 30,000 people. That's 20 times. And the point of large constituencies was twofold. One, it was, as you say, to filter ordinary people out of office. There's, the era of relatively primitive transportation and communication. In a constituency of 30,000, the only people with large enough reputations to be elected would be a wealthy landholder or perhaps a military hero. So you weren't going to get any innkeepers or, ship makers elected to the legislature. And then the second advantage was kind of creating what I think economists or political scientists would call slack in the agency relationship, meaning that constituents would have a hard time keeping a tight hold on their representatives if you had a geographically vast and very populous constituency. The framers behind the closed doors of the Philadelphia Convention were so explicit about this, and it is another sense in which maybe the word coup is not too much of an overstatement. They said over and over again during the closed doors of the Philadelphia Convention that the Senate was supposed to be like the House of Lords. The Senate would be the protector of the wealth of the country. And of course, they didn't say that in the ratifying contest. They gave different arguments for why the Senate would need 6-year terms in office. They said they needed to accumulate foreign policy expertise because they were going to ratify treaties, right? Even in 1787, 88, they understood that calling the Senate the House of Lords and the protector of the wealth of the nation wasn't going to be a winning argument on the hustings. To what extent were they walking back the promise of the revolution that everyone was created equal? Well, we know they didn't quite believe that, right? They didn't think women should participate in politics. The person who wrote that owned slaves. What exactly do they mean by it? They meant that Americans were as good as the British, and Americans should have a role in how they were governed, and you shouldn't tax them without their consent. There's some great letters written while the state constitutions are being written around 1776, 1777 by elite statesmen who are horrified by how far they're moving in a democratic direction. And again, the reason they're doing that is during wartime. And it's often the case during wartime that countries have to broaden the suffrage, for example, cut back on property requirements for voting, cut back on tax paying requirements for voting, because how else are you going to mobilize ordinary citizens to risk giving up their lives if they don't have a say in government? And that's just always been true in American history, right? World War II is the beginning of the civil rights movement because of the role of Black soldiers. Women got the vote in the United States in World War I because of the role they had played in selling bonds and raising money and providing roles as nurses during World War One. So yeah, the revolution was threatening to run out of control, and in a way, the Constitution was clearly a kind of counter-revolution against the egalitarian forces set in motion by the Revolutionary War.